Hi, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Liza Mainig. After having spent most of my life on and off the mission field, having been raised in the church, and having gone through my own abusive relationships with men and come out the other side, I've realized one important thing in life. A relationship with God is vital. The problem is that we have a lot of religion and legalism in this world, giving us a long to-do list of what we can and cannot do, especially for us ladies. My goal is to create a safe place for women to come together and have the hard, controversial conversations you might not have been able to have before. I want to provoke some critical thinking. I want to hopefully point you towards the Bible and towards a God that might not have been presented to you before. I want us to leave the religion and the legalism behind and be left with a healthy relationship with God. It's time to become who you were meant to be. It's time to become a warrior. To the Warriors podcast, we are still in a series talking about unfulfilled promises, unanswered prayers, because it's important. It's something that everybody deals with. It's something that everybody deals with differently. And in the past, we've had conversations about unanswered promises where somebody's dealt with a lot of grief and disappointment. And we've had other podcasts where people have come on and discussed their hopelessness or how they got from grief to joy. And today I have bit of a different story to tell you with my new friend. I'm going to say it wrong. Malitany Miller. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right.
Yes. You actually responded to a post I made on our Harvest School alumni page. I had several of you come on and do an interview, but your story that you shared with me was a bit unique. But before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, where you're from? Tell us the things.
Yeah. So my name is Malitany. I live in Washington State, in the desert, not the rain side. And I'm a hairstylist. I'm the oldest of how many? 7 kids now.
Oh, God bless you.
Yeah. We adopted a couple from China. So, yeah. And I was raised a farmer, a farm kid.
I love that. I was telling you earlier, I am such a country girl. I would love to live on a farm. So that's really amazing.
It's the best thing ever. I love it. I still love it to this day.
That's awesome. Well, you had reached out to me and I found your story, the little bits that you shared, so relatable to my own story. And I feel like there are tons of women out there who could feel the same and relate to this. Your journey in life was going from reacting to situations and just numbing yourself and not allowing yourself to feel, to finally coming to a vulnerable place with the Lord and being able to feel. But you had a lot of disappointment and a lot of hard stuff happen that caused you to go, I'm going to shut this part off of me. And I so relate to that. It took me so long to be able to feel things again. So I love your story. Can you tell us just a little bit about your journey and what happened in your life that caused you to kind of shut off your emotions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I was raised in a very religious denomination that basically taught us from young up that women are to be seen and not go along with children. And so I was already raised with this mentality of like voice and learning at a young age to perform. And that I would say that began the descent of shutting my emotions down because I was so emotional all the time that I couldn't control what was happening with circumstances, and I couldn't perform properly unless I could shut those down. And so at a young age, I began learning to stuff. And then I thought it was like 5 years ago, but apparently it's only been like 3 or 4. My family we've farmed all of my life, and we actually ended up losing our farm through a series of unfortunate events and just financial issues. We had to sell out, and it was one of the most excruciating things I've ever gone through, because my identity was so wrapped up in being a farm kid. And it was something that in America is kind of a novelty to come from a farm and to live the farm life. And when people would hear about it, it was like there was so much pride over being a farm child. And the fact that, I got to do things as a 9-year-old that most people don't do. And so when that was stripped away, I began having these, like, I can no longer control what was happening in my heart and and so I began learning to just completely shut it, to dissociate whatever it took to put practical thinking in place of what I was feeling. I would do it if it looked like working harder or, reading books or watching movies, whatever I could do to numb myself from actually feeling that pain through, is usually what I would do. And so that was, it was a really long period of learning to dissociate with my feelings, but I got really, really, really good at it. Really good. Unfortunately.
I relate to that because I remember being 10 or 11 years old, and we had a family situation that it was tragic. Fortunately, it didn't end tragic. God brought a lot of restoration to it. But I remember being in that moment, and I was crying on my bed at 10, 11 years old, and it hit me. And I just thought, what does crying do? Like, crying solves nothing. It does nobody any good. So let's just not do that. And it was a very conscious decision that, like you said, that practical or logical thinking kicked in. And I just thought, well, if this isn't going to solve the problem, what is the point of it? So I quit allowing myself to cry. And then it does produce this whole process of going, nope, I'm not going to do that. Nope. And then with every situation, it does like numb you. So was it,
and it also translates into other situations. Like it started out as dissociating from grief, but then in order to not feel grief, you also are having to shut down all of your other emotions too, because you're uncertain as to when grief is going to pop up. And so in order to like avoid that, you also shut down feelings everywhere else. You don't feel your joy. You don't feel compassion for people. It's like all of those things go.
That's so true. Because it is like a sense of control. I liked the way you said that. When you feel out of control, you can control your emotions. And I remember too, even in my journey of being able to feel again, I would start to cry just naturally. And for years, I wouldn't. Nothing really made me cry. And then as I started to do that unraveling, I was like, no, I couldn't control it. And it felt so vulnerable. And I just remember being so disappointed. But what was finally the thing that happened that made you go, okay, I'm totally disconnecting? Like, yes, it was a process, but was there ever a conscious moment where you just were like numb?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, like, I can remember specifically sitting in the living room with my family after equipment had rolled up the lane, and we had that very day given we had rounded our cattle up and sent them off to market. And we sat in the living room as a family. And I remember feeling that wave of emotion coming and knowing that it was pointless and it had never done anything for me in the past. And I couldn't control it. And so I was done. And I also felt very abandoned by the Lord, like feeling like it was his fault that this had happened, and that my dad's dreams, my dreams, like our family's dreams have been completely destroyed. And he wasn't faithful. He wasn't going to take care of me like he should have. And so I wasn't going to dream anymore. And that's still something I'm learning to do again. I wasn't going to dream. I wasn't going to feel. I wasn't going to do it.
Did you have moments when you were losing the farm where you were praying and you were just like, okay, God, like, help us keep the farm, or, like praying and interceding for that situation, and then it still turned out tragically? Or was it just kind of like, I don't even have hope or a desire to pray right now?
I would say it was the latter. Didn't really have hope or desire. I was walking with the Lord, and my family is knowing the Lord, but I wasn't like, I didn't know what intercession was at that time. And I wasn't 100% sold on the fact that prayer really did work. I knew he heard me, and I knew my head says he was faithful. my head also told me it wasn't him. But it was hard to feel comforted by somebody who I was blaming for taking away my dreams and my, whatever it was, identity, what it really was.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of people go through that to some degree, and some people go deeper than others. But I remember, like, in my story too, it was just that constant reinforcement that God wasn't faithful and he wasn't good and he wasn't going to take care. And so I would pray for things, but then I wouldn't expect for them to get better.
Exactly.
So I hit that point where I was like, I'm praying because I'm going through the motions of that's what a believer does, but I don't actually believe that God's going to change it. So I feel like a lot of people have a certain situation where they feel that way, but how did you come out of that?
It's a great question. So actually it happened at Harvest School last year in Africa around this time. I was going on outreach with a bunch of people, and our leader had just sat us down in the airport and told us that, you know, like, this is it's a place full of, there's a lot of witches and demonic stuff that happens here. We're going to be on alert. We're going to, you pray in tongues all the time. We're going to do all this thing, you know, all these things, put the armor on daily, all these things to help us. And as I sat there in the airport, I heard Spirit tell me, he said, you are a feeler. But you've shut down your feelings for so many years because you've been overwhelmed by what your dad is feeling and your mom is feeling and the pain and your family, like all these things. You've shut it down because you've been so overwhelmed by it. But I need you to start feeling again. And so I think when he told me that, I kind of was like, I didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea, but I was like, oh, like, you're right. And I was so open and willing to whatever he had for me. And so I was like, yeah, okay. I see you being able to feel again. And I had no idea. I had no idea what I was praying. Oh, wow. But it was worth it because he walked with me every step of the way through all the emotions that followed. Yep.
And for those who might not know the lingo, what exactly is a feeler? Can you describe that?
That's a good question. So, I mean, everybody would define it differently. For me personally, I actually can feel like what is in the atmosphere. So, like, through COVID, there's been a lot of, like, especially lately, a lot of depression and like hopelessness and powerlessness, like feeling like they have no control over things. And it's like we're just reaching for any kind of control that we can take. So that's how I feel. Sometimes I can walk into rooms and actually feel people's emotions. And it's been a journey of learning, like, before I walk into a space, asking myself, what am I feeling right now? Oh, I'm feeling a lot of joy, excitement for today. I'm ready for this. I'm confident. I feel like I have authority. And I walk into that space. And if I'm suddenly, like, in a moment, feeling powerlessness or hopelessness or depression, it's not my feeling that I'm carrying. It's actually somebody else's that, like, for example, growing up, I always thought that I hated myself, that I was carrying self-hatred, and that I also felt like I was supposed to perform. And now, years later, I'm learning that that was actually feelings I was carrying that were my parents' burdens, and it wasn't even me.
Wow. That's a good way to describe that. I like that because like you and I had talked about, I'm such a feeler. And I really do believe that people who were born to feel the atmosphere around them and to pick up other people's emotions and really what's in the air, I think that's a gift from God. And I think that it's such a powerful tool to be able to walk in the room and pick up on that depression or hopelessness. But then our job is supposed to be prayer and intercession for that thing or that person. But when you don't know how to maturely handle that gift or steward that gift, then you start to go to a room and you're like, there's all the things, and we can become fixers and or we just get attacked and we start to numb. Because I've known a lot of people who are feelers and they start to numb themselves because it's like an overwhelm. You feel way more than other people. That sense is so heightened. And for me, I wasn't so willing as you to start to feel again when it was like this forced purging of my emotions, but my emotions would come out in other ways. Like I know it's silly now because I'm so tiny and I'm more mature and healthy, but years ago I would just get angry and fight people. And so all the emotions would come out in a really aggressive ways.
Yeah.
But then when I started crying and having normal emotions, it was like, what is this? And I would get mad and like run away and not want people to see me. So, so it's a hard process. Like how, when you were, even though you were willingly like, okay, God, I can work with you on this. Were there times in the bush and at Harvest School where you were like, I can't do this. I would rather just go back.
Yeah, absolutely. The Lord told me, he said, when he told me that I was a feeler, he also said, I want you to be prepared that it can be a really intense, wild ride as you learn to understand that it's as I help you discern what's you, what's not you, and what's me. And so I remember one day specifically, I had been at school. We were, they kept us pretty in a familiar environment. So we weren't going out. And so I was feeling really safe. I was getting used to this. It'd been about a week. And then we had a Saturday off and we went to the local mall, and I got like, oh my word, so overwhelmed by the amount of things that was happening around me. And I can't even tell you what I was feeling because I was so overwhelmed by the fact that I was feeling again, that I kept feeling like I was being hit. And then we got into the taxi and there was like a bobblehead that wasn't a normal bobblehead. It definitely was demonic. And I was just like, I could feel the headache coming on. Yep. And I was like, you start like getting panicky. And I think what's challenging as a feeler is I can know it's not me, but like knowing what to do with that is really challenging. I feel like the enemy still attempts to shut me down and be like, oh, you're just going to be voiceless for the rest of your life. You don't have authority or power over this. Like, you open yourself up to being a feeler and you should not have, just like the lies that come. Yeah. And so I didn't do anything about it. And I was like, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. And then actually I had friends at Harvest like, hey, you seem to be having a really off day. We'd love to pray for you. And they like helped me walk through it. But I would say what's really funny is he was opening my mind up to the fact that I was a feeler. I could feel things in the spirit realm, but I didn't realize until honestly this last month that he actually wants more than that. He wants my heart to be open to him, because when I'm dissociating from my feelings here on earth, it's also translating to my relationship with the Father. Yeah. So if I'm not allowing myself to feel anger here, because that was my thing, I could never be angry. So if I'm not allowing myself to feel anger and I'm praying in intercession and asking the Lord to share with me his heart, he can't share with me about his righteous anger over the injustices in our world because I don't feel anger. That's such a good point. I've been realizing how this translates to the Father. And if I don't have compassion, I don't have compassion for anybody around me. Yep.
That's such a good point. I like the way you said that, because it's so true. Like I will say for me, I'm an 8 Enneagram, like the challenger. I am a strong personality. So the anger and aggression and the need for justice is very real to me. And so I would feel lots of anger, and the Lord has really had to teach me the difference between righteous anger and my just fleshly anger, and what is true justice versus what the world says justice is. And I've learned too, in my seemingly unanswered prayers, and when I've prayed for something and then it didn't come to pass, or it seemed like a tragedy happened instead, it was reinforcing a disappointment after disappointment. And when I sat in that disappointment, I then became very bitter. And then there was no room for God to come in and say, actually, I was doing this, and this, but you were looking at the wrong thing or looking through the wrong lens. And it became harder for me to shift my perspective and look through a different lens and go, oh God, like you were still faithful, you were still good, and you were still doing something. And so I think it's important what you said of, if you're sitting in one unhealthy or negative thing, it makes it really hard for God to come in your relationship and show you the opposite. That's such a good point. How did those lack of emotions affect your relationship with the Lord in all those years?
Oh man, I think I really love what you were saying about lenses, because I've been learning about that. Like, if you see through lenses of religion, like I was, the way I viewed God was, he's a guy with a big stick. He's not for me. He's not good. Even though I would say those things aloud, like I didn't actually believe them. So I think, like, in the last few weeks, learning that God actually loves my emotions because he's given them to me, and my feelings, and he actually longs to sit with me through those really hard places, instead of viewing him as a God who is going to beat me over the head if I feel emotions or I cry.
We do have a tendency to see God through our humanness. I think in general, all over the world, but I can speak definitely from an American standpoint, we have a hard time allowing each other to have any kind of emotion that is not like positive. And especially as believers, what I've noticed is when you see somebody hurting, the tendency is to want to go and fix it and throw a bunch of scripture at them and then say like, oh, but let's make all these declarations and it'll be okay. And if you're discouraged or hopeless, then here, quote these verses or say these, positive things, or like declare prophetic words over your life, which is all good. But for some reason, we don't really allow each other to sit in our grief or to sit in our disappointment and say, that was really hard. There's a lot of value in being able to sit there and just go, I hate this. I love the whole book of Psalms, because David continuously in every single chapter would have these where he'd be like, God, I can't see you. What are you doing? Like, I am nothing. Like, this is worthless. Da, da, da. But he would always end it on, okay, but you are faithful. You are good. And I think it's important that we allow ourselves to have that moment. And I'm not going to lie, like, I've had plenty of conversations with God where I have just driven and yelled and cried and cursed. And God he's not intimidated by your curse words. He's not intimidated by the things that you say to him, because he already knows anyway. But my goal when I get into the prayer room now is to leave different than how I came in.
Yeah. Amen. Yes.
Yeah. Like if I go to the Lord,
he already knows. You might as well tell him.
Right. If I go to him and I just yell, scream, curse, and complain, and then I leave and go about my day and I still feel angry or pissed off about that thing, I didn't deal with it. Exactly. I think the goal is let yourself feel the things and then leave it at the feet of Jesus. But tell us how did you start to do that with the Lord? How did you work out your relationship with him in that area?
It started taking place at Harvest School because he began showing me where my identity should be and where it was. And I mean, it's been a year since I was at school, and I would say the last year has been a continuation of that, and that's going to be life. But honestly, a lot of this stuff has come out in the last probably 2 or 3 weeks, which is really ironic that we're talking about this because I think like grief is grief. So I don't care what you're grieving. It can be simplest of things. Like sometimes I feel like we grieve situations where God is asking us to surrender something and move into a new season. And I've told him before he'd ask for something, I'd say, I want to do that. Like I'm going to, but I need to sit here and grieve this before I move to the next situation. And he always has so much grace for that. He's like, absolutely, I'm going to sit with you until you're ready to move to the next season. And I'm going to move with you. I'm not going to move without you. And I think that has been so powerful for my heart, because as a performer, like years ago, I would have said, "Oh yes, Lord, I surrender. I'm ready to go." But he would know better. And so I would end up staying in places for longer periods of time that I probably would have had to if I had been open and honest. And so I think for me in the last week, learning that I want my prayer room to be a place of like deep and true authenticity. And if it's not, we're staying until I can be real with the fact that I am feeling this pain, whatever this is. And don't be overwhelmed. Like, I think that's the biggest thing. Don't be overwhelmed. God isn't overwhelmed. He's not scared of your emotions. He's seen grief in the most, I feel like he's experienced and carried a load of grief in the garden.
Yep.
It says he sweat great drops of blood, and that when we were in Israel, it taught us that his heart literally burst and it seeped through his skin, because his heart was burdened and grieving for a nation, for a world. And so allowing yourself to sit there and really feel that grief all the way through, or whatever it is, whatever emotion you're feeling, anger, and walk. Like, I love what you said about walking out of the prayer room different. That is so important. So important that you come out. There's that song that says, "Don't leave me the same. I want to know you more," or something like that. Anyway, really, really powerful. And I love that.
Yes. And that's such a good point too, that God has experienced grief. Like, if we read the scriptures, it talks about how Holy Spirit was grieved, or and God was grieved, or Jesus wept. And so to not allow each other to have those emotions is kind of weird when you really think about it, because Holy Spirit is emotional. God was, Jesus was emotional. He cried, he wept with those who wept. He sat with people and he mourned with them. And so there's something to be said about sitting there in that moment, like you were saying, because, God could speak to us and say, "Hey, get up. I need you to go from point A to point B." But when we rush it and we just, like you were saying, go through the motions or perform and say, "Oh, okay, I know the right answer or the right move, so I'm going to do it now," we do kind of end up having to go in circles for a bit because we didn't deal. And I love how I've learned just reading the Bible, which people just don't really do as much as they should. But when you read the Bible and just the 4 Gospels, Jesus really took time with people to be with them, whether they were right or wrong in their sad situation. He was so gentle with them. He was so caring and loving. So what makes us think that he's not going to give us that minute to just sit with us and go, "Okay, let's cry it out. Let's get this out of the way. And then we're going to get up and move on." That's a great point. For women who might be listening that do deal with that numbing, that are maybe in a space where they haven't really allowed themselves to feel much anymore, what advice would you give to those women?
I think, anytime I'm struggling to feel, it's oftentimes coming from a place of needing to control something. I'm feeling out of control in an area of my life, like something's chaotic, something's full of chaos. And so, the one thing I know to revert back to control that works is my emotions. And so I guess I would challenge people to ask the question, where is the lack of wanting to feel coming from? Is there a disconnect with Father? Like, am I in a place where I'm needing to control because I am not trusting what Father God? He's not going to take care of me. He's not going to provide for me. He's not going to cover me and protect me. And oftentimes, like, I still go through cycles of this. And I think this is going to be probably one of my fights for life, is allowing myself the space to feel when it's necessary. Cause I can also learn your triggers.
Yes. Amen.
Like, what you do, learn your triggers as to what you're doing. Like, for me, if I am not wanting to feel, I'm going to create busyness around me. I'm going to pick up extra things. I'm going to, work harder, longer hours. I'm going to, those are just my things. Some people will go into, like, they'll sleep all the time. They're going to stress eat. Just learn what your what your mentality is whenever you're trying not to feel things. And then as much as you don't want to, I understand, sit down, grab a journal, grab some soaking music, and just tell the Father what is happening. I would encourage you just begin digging a little bit through the chaos and asking questions, asking where this came in, where did this disconnect happen? Am I not trusting the Father? Am I controlling my emotions? And just let yourself feel, walk out of that space different, like we said earlier.
I love that. It's so practical. And I feel like you and I are very similar in a lot of ways, like, because it is practical advice, but then it's definitely something people need to learn. What are your triggers? I definitely increase coffee. Like normally I have 1 cup of coffee in the morning and then I switch to tea and water. But when I'm super stressed and overwhelmed and I'm like, I don't have time, I start drinking a whole lot of coffee and I clean like everything and become like really OCD. And then I do that same thing with the busyness so that everything becomes very fast paced. And then therefore I don't feel anything. But I have also seen people who will just crawl in bed and people who will just binge watch TV. And we put things in place to where we don't have to even go there. But when we get quiet, when we stop talking, when we put the phone down, all of a sudden the thoughts in our heads get very loud and that feels overwhelming. But it is so good and practical to say, grab a journal or go do something. Some people don't like to journal, like go find something that is a release that gets all the gladness out of your head and you can get it out there and just surrender that and feel that. Just on a closing note, what would you say the biggest takeaway for the listeners would be today? If there's one thing you wanted somebody to walk away with, what would that be?
I think your relationship with the Father being restored. And it's going to start with allowing yourself to feel, because you're going to allow yourself to feel his heart for you. And I know it's super overwhelming to even think about going down this road, but trust me, it does get better and your emotions will even out. Like mine have leveled. I'm not so up and down dramatic as I used to be. I'm really even keeled now. I saw my things like we all do, but it does get better. And in order to understand the Father's heart for you and for this world and this nation, you're going to have to allow yourself to feel what he feels. It's part of the journey.
Yeah, that's so good. Yes. And I would even say to people, it doesn't matter what you have or haven't been through, because like you said, sometimes the tragedy is in the little things that you would not expect. It's in the things that might feel a little silly to even tell other people how deeply it impacted you, but yet it did something to you. And then some people have extreme trauma that they have to work through. So it doesn't matter what end of the spectrum you're on. Like you said, I love the way you said it. And I'm going to steal that and start saying it. Grief is grief. And it's hard because it's yours. So I agree. I think just regardless of what you've been through, letting yourself go to that place, because you're honestly never really going to get over whatever that thing is, whatever that disappointment, unanswered, whatever was, until you let yourself go there and you feel the feels and you work it out with the Lord. So I love it. It was practical. It's powerful. Yeah. Everybody can relate to that. Thank you for coming on.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yes. If our listeners wanted to find you on social media, could they do that? And how would they do that? Okay.
My personal page on Instagram is called Malitany Pay. It's Mitney and then Pay. Pay. And then you can find my hair page from there, and my Facebook is Malitany page. So I love to disciple and encourage women, especially in these areas of feeling and grief, because I don't care what your level of grief is. Like if you're grieving at the loss of a child or the child leaving your home, like, or, a lot of COVID, there's been a lot of grief that's happened through COVID for not being able to graduate and not being able to have that big wedding and all these things. And I just want to validate you right now that I don't care what your grief is, it's valid. And you are allowed to sit and feel it, and it's okay. It's not silly.
Yep, that's so good. And if anybody has questions or prayer requests or just want to chat about anything, absolutely send a private message. You can even go to lizamainig.com. You can send me an email there. I always love to chat with you. So thank you so much again. I appreciate it. We will see you in the next episode.